Mr. Knowles, how do you think you would fare under a government that has the reach and, intimacy that you are advocating for?
I think I would fare fairly well because, while I agree with Brad's point that we have far too many bureaucrats on the federal payroll, the recent upending of laws concerning sex and gender have come from elected and appointed officials. It's come from the Supreme Court, appointed by presidents. It's come from legislators in Charlotte, North Carolina, and all over the country. So it has been from representatives of the people and appointed officials who've been appointed by representatives of the people, and the people change their minds. That's one of the features of democracy. And so, unfortunately, the Supreme Court in 1973 decided that there were some imaginary right to abortion, and this error persisted for a long time. And then 49 years later, the court reversed that decision. In 2020, the Supreme Court made an error and decided to interpret civil rights law protections for sex as being protections for sexual orientation and gender identity, which ironically undermines civil rights protections for sex by allowing the men to play on those sports teams and go to the bathrooms. And so in this case, I know, Brad, you keep suggesting that I want this very narrow, authoritarian, totalitarian view. I don't. There are all sorts of questions where I'm happy to leave things pretty open. But on certain issues where only one side can establish its principle in society, we have to come to conclusions. And I would come to the conclusion that has prevailed for all of human history, not the one that cropped up 5 seconds ago.
So I want to push a little on what pressing on these questions and these distinctions means for kind of the stability of our democracy.
Yep.
Because it's one thing when losing power means losing a little bit of ground on some parts of your agenda, the tax rates are set differently, more or fewer oil wells are drilled. And another thing when laws kind of seesaw wildly between administrations. Yep. We have the gag rule on abortion. It's one example of a law that just gets flipped on and off every time the administration changes, and it feels like more and more laws are in that all or nothing executive order thing. It seems to me that makes every election feel apocalyptic.
Yes.
We get more of the Flight 93 talk, right? How do you see a way out or through that, right? If people feel losing an election means losing ground possibly permanently, it doesn't seem we can live alongside each other at all. We've already lost faith in democracy, kind of regardless of where we draw the line when we're in power.
This is such an important point. And the reason that you've seen this kind of radical polarization where now we go topsy-turvy every election is every election that we're able to win, for that matter. Sometimes the Democrats rule for a long time. The reason for that is because we no longer have shared norms and standards. And so the very thing that I am arguing is a solution to this problem. The reason that our norms and standards have broken down is because half a century ago, leftist activists decided to upend our standards and norms in our culture, to say that having any standards or norms at all would be authoritarian and anti-American. And so what happened was the left pushed their radical new standards. In the 1950s, in the 1940s, you could read the Bible in schools. You could not read pornography in schools. Today, you cannot read the Bible in schools. You can, and in some cases, are assigned to read pornography in schools. It's not a battle of more freedom or less freedom. It's a battle of what standards are we going to have, what taboos are we going to have. And so what happened, especially in the 60s, is the left knocked down all of the old standards. They insisted upon their standards in their place, and the conservatives lost the ability to even speak about standards, to even speak about the good, the true, and the beautiful, the common good, what's true and false. And as a result, the left has totally upended things. But I think if we can reassert a sensible vision, then things will go less topsy-turvy.
I want to indulge my nerdery for 1 second, then pose a last question to you two, then we'll take questions from the audience. Mr. Knowles, do you really think this is a question of the left pushing, or more of what Alistair McIntyre describes as just the losing, for many people, including conservatives, of a sense of where order comes from, till we don't have a language to speak together? Not one side putting forward new norms, but all sides nearly losing touch with what gives rise to their norms that they learned kind of habitually from their community without learning them from the roots up.
Well,
I think you're blaming just one side here, and I don't know that I believe you on that.
No, I blame both of those things, but I think one is a consequence of the other. If not entirely a consequence, largely a consequence. Why are people not in touch with the basis of order and truth? Might it have something to do with the fact that left-wing activists booted the Bible out of schools? Why is it that people don't have a solid formation about the grounding of our government and our public life? Might it have something to do with the fact that a judge decided that preachers can no longer speak about political things, that religion now has to be merely a private matter for the inner closet of your own consciousness rather than a matter of public life? To me, these are not separate questions. And I point to the left because they have been so conscious and intentional about this kind of a strategy, and because feckless conservatives bought on with the logic. There's a line from William F. Buckley, Jr., who's very important to this organization, that I always come back to from God and Man at Yale. And he was quoting a liberal, actually, who said it. And he said, "Skepticism has utility only when it leads to conviction. It's nice to have a big open society, but sometimes people's minds are so open that their brains fall out. A poem is beautiful because of its limits and its constraints. We are limited beings, and so we can't be all things to all people because then we're not anything to anyone."
Can I just hop
yes,
in
you
and
may.
say something?
Give him a bit of time there, yes.
Yeah. So you say that you want the truth, the freedom to speak the truth and the good and the beautiful and everything else. But at the same time, I mean, you'd toss up and rip up the First Amendment to stop drag queens from reading books to kids.
The First Amendment doesn't protect that.
It does.
It doesn't. The First Amendment, from the beginning of our country, has not protected whole scores of speech. Obscenity, notably, in this case.
It is not obscene if it's... So first of all, you could ban all sexual performances, drag or not, from having minors, and I would support that. But to have a fully clothed...
So you'll shred the First Amendment?
No, that is obscenity. There's a very clear standard of what obscenity is. And a fully clothed person, who is simply dressed in the attire of the other gender and wearing makeup, reading books to children, is protected by the First Amendment.
Brad, for much of our country's history, cross-dressing was illegal throughout the country, including in San Francisco.
Acts. We had slavery, just because we didn't always live up to the
We still
values.
are part of the Alien Sedition Acts.
But they're not enforced. But so I'm saying just because we had things in the past doesn't mean they're actually consistent with our rights and values.
I suppose what you're saying, though, Brad, is, Michael, your view is anti-American, and it's not consistent with the First Amendment. And what I'm pointing to is the people who wrote the First Amendment, the people who ratified the First Amendment, the people who lived in a country under the First Amendment for the vast majority of our country's history, they all agreed with me, and people in very recent times have started to pervert the meaning of the First Amendment to kind of agree with your
The people who wrote the First Amendment also wrote the Alien and Seditions Act.
So now you're saying the First Amendment's no good.
But the text of the Constitution and the principles outlined are what's important, not the imperfections of the people that drafted them.
This is what I want to ask you a little bit about where you see those principles and what they lead to. Because I think there are two ways to interpret what we want out of free speech, and I know which side Mr. Knowles stands on, so he's not getting the question. One is that free speech, open discourse, is a good in and of itself, possibly to avoid coercion or too large a government that would be needed to suppress speech. But the other view, which is the view I know Mr. Knowles holds, so he's not going to need to respond to this one, is that the reason we want freedom of speech is to arrive at truth, in the same way that we want peer review in scientific journals, not so that there's ultimately a panoply of voices, but so that by hearing everyone out, we wind up with one voice speaking one thing that is true. And I'm curious, for you, Mr. Polumbo, do you see the point of free speech as an end in itself, a protection from coercion, or as a tool to slowly, gravitate towards one thing that is true, and free speech is a tool that gets us there, but not the good we are pursuing?
So I definitely reject the utilitarian view of free speech. Now, I think to some extent both can coexist, in that I think the best ideas do win out over time, and that sunlight can be a strong form of disinfectant. But there is utility in and of itself of letting man be free to say wrong and false things.
And tell me about what you like about that, because you've rejected one version of it. So what is the good you see in doing that?
That's the most fundamental aspect of what if you're not free to speak, you're not free to think. Right? That is one of the most fundamental things about humanity.
I'm going to press one more time, just because for the interest of time, I'm going to do it more briefly than I know Mr. Knowles would. What is the good of being free to think?
To explore and find the best ideas, in part, but also to fulfill the human experience. That's what life is learning and making your way through the world and deciding what you believe. And if you're not free to think and you're not free to speak, you're not able to do that. So it's like the idea of, for example, coerced morality isn't really morality, right? Because if people are doing the right thing or believing that, for example, like everyone's very loyal to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, but there's not actually much value in that loyalty because it's done at the threat of death.
A lot of value for Kim Jong-un.
All right, at this point...
And you would like to be Kim Jong-un.
Do you? I don't think I would. I wouldn't look as good in the suits. I don't think I would.
I have more questions, but since I am not Kim Jong-un, I will not be a tyrant and use the time for questions.